When the Lord calls me home and time shall be no more, I will fly with his angels to that far and distant shore.
Welcome, everybody, to Radicalized Truth Survives. My name is Heidi Kuda, and today Jim Hi-Fi and I have the distinct pleasure of interviewing American journalist Katherine Stewart. She has an explosive new book, Money, Lies, and God. Have a listen. Welcome so much to Rad Pod, Katherine Stewart. You're looking at 3 fans of yours. We have seen the film, we've read the books, and we're so grateful for the work that you do, specifically in the space around Christian nationalism, of course. And where I'd like to start with you is the title of your new book, because I think in 3 words, you are able to sum up our crises very well.
Money, lies, and God. Because first, money is a huge part of the story behind the sort of insanity we're seeing in our government, behind all the sort of theocratic moves, behind the Supreme Court decisions, all of it really, we're seeing a massive wave of plutocratic cash, huge concentrations of wealth over the past decades at the very tippy top of the economic ladder have really destabilized the political system in some really interesting ways. Of course, America has a lot of very rich people, and it's only a subset of the super, super rich that are funding this movement. But the amounts of money going through toward this sort of anti-democratic movement are really extraordinary. And I detail that in my book, Money, Lies, and God. Now, second, lies or conscious disinformation, conspiracism, is another huge feature of the movement. Movement leaders know that if you can separate people from the facts and make them afraid, it really makes them easier to control. So a lot of the funders are devoting a portion of their donations to these huge disinformation networks, propaganda networks, and initiatives like the Reawaken America Tour, which you guys are so familiar with. And then number 3, of course, God, because the most important ideological framework for the largest part of this movement is Christian nationalism. I think Christian nationalism, of course, is a way to get the rank and file on board. It's, I think, the single most important part of the anti-democratic coalition in a way, because it motivates a lot of the voters. It motivates a lot of the activists to get involved in supporting anti-democratic candidates. And I think a lot of the people who I think of religious nationalism not as just a set of attitudes held by millions of the rank and file, not just a label that people use to identify themselves, but also a political dynamic that afflicts political systems, sort of like authoritarianism. So a lot of the disinformation operations that we're seeing are actually targeting pastors to get their congregants out to vote, or they're operating in churches and other faith-based spaces. So they're really exploiting religion for politics and power.
Thank you so much for that incredible intro. And I just want to thank you so much for actually going into the trenches where this is taking place. A lot of people report from the edges and on the outside, and you're actually in the center of it, reporting and talking to people as you see it. And I think that's vital to your work and to your book. I also want to thank you because so many people who we've interviewed who've done this work stay away from the disinformation component. And I think that's actually why we're here. So I got 2-part question. One, how do you see disinformation having played its role in bringing us a second Trump term? And then if you can just explain to our viewers how this man who does not represent the godly things that I was raised with can be so embraced by this culture and by this group. Thank you.
Oh, those are great questions. So first, how did he become entwined with this group? It's a long story. I mean, we don't have time to get into the weeds. I really detail that in my book. But to summarize, it's both for transactional reasons and also precisely because of Trump's lawlessness, his authoritarian qualities. He's the perfect representative of a movement that frankly doesn't believe in democracy or the rule of law as democracy prescribes it. So First, transactional. He gave movement leaders everything they want, unprecedented political power and access to public money and private sources of money, policies that privilege certain religious and political viewpoints, and of course, that privilege individuals. And of course, he gave them judges that could help bring about Supreme Court decisions that would impose upon an unwilling general public policies that movement leaders have wanted for a long time. But there's more to it than simply transactional. Oh, just one last thing I'll say on that note. I've seen Trump speak at a number of religious right gatherings or Christian nationalist gatherings. He speaks at the March for Life. I've seen him speak at Pray Vote Stand, which is one of the big conferences, or the Road to Majority conference, and other large sort of gatherings. And he'll always say, I think I gave you everything you want, and I think I even gave you more. He doesn't say we got what we wanted and we got even more. It's almost like you supported me, so I'm going to do for you. It's like a transaction. So, but they adore him. I mean, in those spaces, he is really revered as a messianic figure. And that speaks to the second part of why they support him. They compare him to a biblical king, like King Cyrus or King David, as sort of a flawed ruler that God chose to enact his will, right? They see, in many cases, this sort of political battles in the here and now being a reflection of spiritual battles taking place in the heavens. And they think God has chosen Donald Trump to defeat his enemies. If anybody wins an election, it's against God's will. And here's the thing about, kings. They're not the kings of democracies, right? They are the law unto themselves, right? And so that sort of makes him a perfect ruler for an authoritarian movement, a movement that has been sort of anti-democratic and authoritarian at its core. And then the second question you asked is really, how did this movement take root in the United States, and how did is that the second question you asked? I'm sorry, you have to.
Yeah, no, I
Yeah.
apologize because I see disinformation intertwined with the embracing by the religious right with Donald Trump. And again, a lot of people who have we've talked to who've written about some of the religious extremism that we've experienced in America, they are not comfortable talking about the disinformation that people are fed. And I feel like it's right there in your title, Lies. And I think it's just incredibly important that you talk about it as much as you do, because again, it's almost like cultic tactics. People are lied to, and then
Yeah.
they
Yeah. I mean, I think that you can't understand how so many Americans supported this movement, a leader of the Donald Trump, and who support this movement in general, without noting the critical role of disinformation. They've really declared a war on the truth. Let's just look at a few things that they do. They depend in a really fundamental way on a war on the facts. I mean, one of the first casualties of sort of fact-free hyper-partisanship is competence in government. We can see it in the whole Doge fiasco, right? What kind of government fires the people who handle nuclear weapons or exposes classified information on semi-functional? What kind of government fires the people who handle nuclear weapons and food safety, or exposes classified information on semi-functional websites, or takes a sledgehammer to consumer protection agencies and air traffic control? What kind of an administration declares war on scientific research, one of the generators of economic wealth, and something that has actually that you know made us admired all over the world? I mean, how do we get so much incompetence in one place at one time? We've got attacks on universities, various kinds of expertise. It's really taking a sledgehammer to what has made us great. Well, the present government and the movement behind it, the anti-democratic movement coalition behind it, doesn't just tell you that up is down, right? It sort of tells you this when the truth of the situation is staring at you in the face. And then incredibly, they base policy on lies, on the idea that up is down. Um, so, for example, the administration came to power in part by claiming, what is our greatest problem facing our nation? Is it the fact that so many American children live in poverty, that so many Americans can't afford their homes? Is it that the price of um, life in the United States is becoming unsustainable, that the number one cause of death among children and adolescents is gun violence? No. They said our biggest problem we face is what they call wokeness, or diversity, equity, and inclusion. And they use that to launch attacks on free speech, on higher education, on science research, and on civil rights legislation. They manufacture propaganda all the time. They say our public schools are nothing more than Marxist indoctrination factories that exist to change children's gender. This is ridiculous, of course, but they use this lie to justify the dismantling of public education. They say that Democrats want to abort babies after they're born, which isn't a thing. That doesn't happen. That's called infanticide and it's illegal. But they use this lie to restrict various kinds of the most sort of popular and effective forms of birth control or prevent pregnancy in its very earliest stages. So, above all, I think we can see this is a movement that is waging war on the truth. Okay, I detail a lot of these disinformation operations in Money, Lies, and God. Reawaken America, of course, is one of them, but there are also what they call pink slime news sites that some of the funders are funding. They're funding these, uh, I would say, news operations that really exist either to spread disinformation or to take a sort of minor story that doesn't really matter and make it the story of the day. It's sort of like, deploying the politics of outrage in order to distract Americans from the real problems facing them.
Wow, thank you so much for that, Jim.
That's amazing. Thank you. There's a passage in your book on this topic that I love, that I was going to ask you about anyway, that I think is really relevant. My favorite line: when you pay people to be unreasonable, you attract many unreasonable people. This seems like a very basic kind of idea, but what it does, right? And you describe it more. I'll just finish the paragraph. You may even become a bit of a crank yourself. If your power depends on lying to people, that doesn't make you noble. It just leaves you with a choice: accept that you are a fraud or embrace the lie. And so I wanted to hear you talk a little bit about the embrace the lie part, because I think people misunderstand sometimes that these people are just lying on purpose. I think many of them actually have crossed over to believing it themselves in a way that self-perpetuates. So effectively, they have ended up brainwashing themselves. And so I apologize for the longish question, but I just wanted to hear you talk a little bit more about that because I think it relates to what you were saying to Heidi.
Absolutely. When you spend time in this world, you hear a lot of the same messages repeated over and over and over. And look, we can't know what's in people's hearts. This is very much a leadership-driven movement. Which of the leaders really believe what they're saying, and which one of them are deploying these lies for, just because their lies are too valuable to abandon simply because they're not true? It's hard to know. But I do think that a lot of people have drunk the Kool-Aid. Some of them must know. I mean, a lot of, like, so for instance, I went to this gathering called Faith Wins. It's one of the pastor gatherings. One of the way this movement works is by gathering pastors into networks, and leaders, movement leaders will come and do presentations. Sometimes there's dozens of pastors. I went to one gathering with hundreds, and they want to get the pastors on board because they can motivate their congregations to turn out the vote, right? So there was people like David Barton, who's a sort of myth maker, Christian national of the Christian nationalist movement. His work has been discredited by academic historian after academic historian, but he's, very valuable to the movement. Then Chad Connolly of the Council for National Policy, of course, which is one of the leading networking organizations of the movement. Then they brought along this guy named Hogan Gidley. He had a job in the first Trump administration, and he was billed as an elections integrity specialist. And he's up there, telling these pastors, oh, you saw what happened in the last election. They had dead people voting. And then he said, you all saw what happened in Arizona. Well, this was several weeks after a group of Republicans, they called themselves the Cyber Ninjas. They were convinced that there was voter fraud in Arizona. They did a deep dive, and then at the end of it, they were motivated to find voter fraud. They could have tried to manufacture it, but instead they held up their hands. They said, we got nothing. It turns out there are a couple dozen more votes for Joe Biden than we anticipated. So we're sorry. We really thought there was voter fraud, but there wasn't. But what Hogan Gidley said to these pastors, you all saw what happened in Arizona, implying, as if to imply that there was some voter fraud. And everybody's sort of murmuring and, yeah, oh, Arizona, because they're not maybe reading the fact-based news, fact-checked news that you or I might be reading. They're sort of perpetuating, implying that there was voter fraud, strongly implying it, and everybody seems to believe it, even though this is not true. Now, does Hogan Gidley really believe? It's we can't know again what's in people's hearts. But what you do see in this world is so many of these messages repeated over and over. The idea that a supposedly woke elite is absolutely destroying the country. We're on a precipice. The consequences of loss are, in the political arena are too dire to ignore. And this clears the way for the acceptance of a strongman, like an authoritarian leader who's going to abandon the rule of law in favor of the iron fist, who's going to abandon the Constitution, and who will really consolidate authoritarian form of political power. Do they really think this is better for this nation, or do they really think it's better for their own careers and pocketbooks? Again, we can't know what's in people's hearts, but two things can be true at the same time. I think a lot of these folks know that they're really going to enrich themselves. They're enriching themselves, some of them, as we speak. I mean, we're not really clearing the way for a pure theocracy in the truest sense. We're really clearing the way for a cronyistic kleptocracy with authoritarian and theocratic features. But I think for a lot of these leaders, they see that it's good for their pocketbooks and their careers, but they may also really believe the lies that they're spreading.
Wow. One of our mantras on this show is two things can be true at once because we keep on seeing evidence of that. Thank you for that. High fidelity.
So I've been in the technology field for 25 years. I worked in Silicon Valley for a little over the last decade. Um, I I have a history with a Russian billionaire named Sergey Gishian. So imagine my surprise when I open your book and he is in the very first paragraph I see. So, can you tell me, A, why'd you put him in the first paragraph? And B, tell me about Silicon Valley and how it's enabling these lies, this Christian nationalism.
Wow,
Great question.
great questions. Let's take the first. I'm so curious to hear your um, history with Sergey Grishin. Maybe you can tell me later. But I happen to be familiar with Sergey Grishin because I used to write for Santa Barbara Magazine, still do sometimes, and I was assigned a piece about this estate, as for historic estate. Christopher Isherwood spent time there, and a whole lot of other historical figures. As you know, Santa Barbara has a sort of deep history. A lot of people, really interesting folks, literary people, actors, etc., have sort of flocked to the area. And Sergey Grishin at the time was buying a whole bunch of houses. I think he bought a couple of contiguous properties, and I was familiar with him because he bought this property that I was supposed to write about. So I looked into him. He is, I think, responsible for, nearly bringing a sector of the Russian sort of financial world to its knees. He's one of these guys who made a lot of money and then took it out of the country. Why is this man buying four estates in Montecito, in a span of a year and a half? So his home was sold to um, Meghan Markle and her husband. Um, they occupied one of the houses that he had bought at a certain point. So that's why Sergey Gishian, the first chapter opens in Montecito, where is now that royal couple or ex-royal couple is not, they're not, as far as I can tell, funders of this movement at all. But there was somebody who lived not too far away who was a funder of the movement. And so I was sort of describing Montecito a bit. And that's why Sergey Gishian's name or a reference to his property certainly was in the or his former property was in that first chapter.
You aren't afraid of talking about Silicon Valley. You're not afraid of talking about all these things that have contributed to this anti-democratic movement taking root. And that is something that, again, many people still don't see it. And I don't know how they can see it. We're going to, of course, encourage people to buy and read your book, but how do we explain to people that this anti-democratic movement took root? There was nobody who wasn't targeted in one way or the other, and people who have strong faith, their faith got weaponized.
That's true. The movement has exploited religion for politics and power. It's really, I think, in order to help people understand the movement, I really make clear that this is a leadership-driven movement. It's leadership-driven, it's organization-driven. The power of the movement is in this deep organizational infrastructure that has developed over the past 5+ decades, and much of it functions as a giant voter turnout machine. But we also have to understand that there's a real disconnect between the agenda of the funders, who want policies that are going to privilege them, entrench their privileges, justify their privileges, and increase their fortunes, and the agenda of the rank and file, who are being distracted with this culture war stuff, some of which is utter nonsense. But if you strip away all that stuff, they really want a better deal for themselves and for the workforce. And I think those contradictions can be highlighted, and they should be. I mean, the movement has always had wealthy donors, but thanks to growing economic inequality, the number of zeros in the donations has just increased to a massive degree. These wealthy donors are motivated, again, by a desire to advance their interests and protect their privileges, but also to justify their privileges and this massive concentration of wealth. And this is where some of the tech bros come in. They're typically informed by some kind of libertarian ideology. Of course, some of them are motivated by more overtly religious and cultural goals in addition to their economic ideals. We, of course, have power players, leaders of the organizations or very powerful religious leaders who, run organizations that make serious money by promoting these kinds of authoritarian ideas. And then we have a whole set of media empires and initiatives whose basic business model is to spread all kinds of disinformation for profit. When you're looking at the tech bros, they're not remotely motivated by religious goals, right? Although maybe they think that, oh, we can keep the people in line with religion, the little people, keep them voting in the way that we want them to be voting. So, in a sense, they see the sort of religious nationalism as just the price of doing business for getting what they want. But the movement has all kinds of fault lines, and those fault lines can be highlighted and exploited, and they should be.
Good. That's where our final question will be, how do we exploit those fault lines? How do we reunite America? How do we see our way out of this? I've got a couple other questions, but Jim, you go.
Um, One of the things that I've been very interested in is this sort of meme of anti-communism as a through line for so long, right? As an excuse for scapegoating people in different ways, right? Hitler obviously used it and conflated Jews with communists, leading in many ways to the Holocaust. You see this sort of strain of anti-communism continue all the way till today, where Trump is out there going, we're going to get the communists in the government. And he has no idea what a communist means, right? At all. But it has become this scapegoat, right? With cultural Marxism being kind of this, midpoint where they divine this conspiracy theory about the Frankfurt School and all of this stuff. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts kind of on how that particular idea has morphed into what we see today, because I see it as kind of one of the legs of this movement, as you will. There's the technology guys, the anti-communists, and the theocrats in a sense. And so anyway, I'll stop talking. I just wanted to hear you talk a little bit about anti-communism as a theme.
The funniest thing that I'm thinking as you talk is that, like, every accusation is a kind of admission. So separate from what communism actually was historically and means, this is a movement that wants to consolidate control. This is a movement that is banning hundreds of words in various sectors of our research apparatus, various sectors of government, words like socioeconomic and status and pollution and belong, hundreds of words. This is from the movement that lectured us for decades about free speech and cancel culture. The most recent thing I think of is this directive that the State Department order its employees to rat out their colleagues, to tell on colleagues who are engaged in quote unquote anti-Christian bias. Now, what the hell does this mean? Anti-Christian bias? Is it, that they're being biased against social justice? No, movement leaders actually think social justice and empathy is heretical. I mean, some of them literally call social justice a kind of woke heresy destroying the American church. So instead, there's like Trump mentioned anti-abortion activists who broke the law and actually engaged in actions that have hurt people. He pardoned a bunch of them, uh, actions that resulted in injury, sort of violent actions. So it's sort of this idea that people are supposed to rat out their colleagues. I mean, I have contacts who work for government who are told that they need to rat out their colleagues who are engaged in diversity, equity, and inclusion. What the hell does that mean? It's everything they don't like. The idea that anybody other than a conservative white man in government is a diversity hire. Remember Amy Coney Barrett, who's got a really impressive, frankly, I don't agree with her opinions on a lot of stuff, but she's got an impressive resume. She voted somehow or ruled in a way that was distinct from the sort of her hard right fellow justices, and they called her a diversity hire. So it's a way to smear anyone who's sort of not on board. Anyway, this is where a lot of the where I think about every admission. I mean, every accusation is admission. They're even using terms like phrases like schools are for education, not indoctrination, and yet they're the ones who are trying to in, infiltrate and undermine public education, siphon away taxpayer money that's yours and mine to directly fund ultra-conservative religious schools. And they're trying to do this through various means. There's a big case before the Supreme Court related to a charter school fully fund. They want to fully funded religious charter school in Oklahoma, St. Isidore Academy. If the Supreme Court rules that way, it will open the floodgates of taxpayer funding for schools that are
Wow.
free to teach creationism, contempt for people of other
Yeah.
faiths, and whatever. So,
I mean, I think
Thank you.
if you think about the border czar,
Mhm.
it might be a little bit of a confession, right?
oh, I mean, disappearing people into gulag, El
Gulags.
Salvador, in some
Yeah.
instances, wrong, like deported for who were people who hadn't committed a crime at all, or maybe just had a butterfly
Yeah.
tattoo or
Yeah.
something like that.
I mean,
Um,
how
and
Stalin can you get, right?
exactly.
Thank you.
Thank you both for that. Hi-Fi often says that science fiction novels weren't supposed to be a user manual for the future, and that film by Jean-Luc Godard, Alphaville, where they're banning words and a mainframe is sort of orchestrating everybody's movement, seems so prescient to me right now. Two more things from me, but High Fidelity, you're next.
So words matter. I think we can all agree that. There's a difference between the phrase conspiracy theory, which is, kind of a belief that some shadowy group is affecting change, and a conspiracy, which is two or more people agreeing to engage in an illegal or harmful act. I would posit that it is not, in fact, a conspiracy theory, but an actual conspiracy that we are seeing in real time involving Christian nationalists, technologists, and as you mentioned, a few very rich people. And they are attempting to not only destroy democracy in America, but democracy globally. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I don't really use the term conspiracy so much. I mean, authoritarianism, or to be less polite, fascism, is really better understood, I think, as something that happens to a political system rather than something that starts off as a full-fledged political program that receives majority support. So I see the anti-democratic movement as sort of pathology, more pathology than a program. And what I mean by that is that it has a number of separate pieces and interest groups that are sometimes working for different aims, but that are nevertheless ending up reinforcing one another. So they're rowing in the same boat in a sense. But here's the thing, the outcome of their collective actions can be really unpredictable and lead to consequences that many of them, and certainly many of the rank and file who are lending their support to this movement, neither anticipate nor want.
You use the term collective psychosis, which I think is incredibly apt here, right? And while I think there are, for me, while I think there are people who actually do conspire, mostly I think it's a tacit agreement where they all realize that they have the same goal, which is in this case the demise of liberal democracy as a, credible form of government. And they just sort of march that way together in the collective.
Exactly. But I do think that there are outcomes that a lot of them would be surprised by,
Oh,
and end
certainly.
up
Yeah,
really
I
forming
think there's a lot of
alliances.
leopards eating faces right now that they're figuring out.
Exactly. I think, again, there are a lot of fissures in this movement. And also, there's just, they're not as rational as they think they are. I mean, do they want a government so
Right.
big that it could interfere in your most intimate decisions, or do they want a government so small you could drown it in a bathtub, as Grover Norquist said? I believe it was him. Do they want, you know, free speech and an absence of cancel culture, or do they want to ban books and words? And take over universities because they don't happen to like uh, some of the things that are happening on those campuses. I mean, there's a lot of incoherence. The movement funders are, they think they're acting in their own interests, and in the short term, they may get some benefit, in terms of policies that privilege them, government contracts or even lower taxes for the rich, et cetera, deregulatory environments so they can frack or drill with impunity or whatever it is, or pollute with impunity. But at the end of the day, are they making things better for their children or grandchildren if they have any? Are they destroying? I mean, look what's happening to the economy now. It's
Right.
bouncing around like a drunken sailor. We've alienated our dearest international allies, and we're allying with, you know, uh, let's say, kleptocratic authoritarians. Is that really going to be good? Is that really going to make America great? Is that really going to sustain our economy? We're seeing these needless trade wars, absolutely needless trade wars that are raising the price of goods and services for ordinary Americans. I just think that this movement is leading to a lot of unintentional consequences. And this is what happens when you have a movement that I also describe as reactionary nihilism. It's
Yeah.
it's nihilistic in the way that it sort of is better defined by what it wants to destroy than what it wants to create. they've talked themselves into a tizzy about how bad the woke elite are, that they want to sort of destroy liberalism. But when they talk about what they want, they know who to hate. But what do they want? And when they talk about what they want, it's always some kind of fantasy version of an imaginary past that never actually existed the way they think it did, and that never actually could exist the way they want it to, but that also includes reactionary features, the idea that, women are subordinate, people, everybody supposedly knows their place in society. There are no deviants. Everybody supposedly has the same religion, which has never been true in America at all. So, I think this sort of fact that they're driven by these sort of fantasies of what they can create is what's leading to all these insane consequences and very dangerous consequences. But look, this is no time to just be paranoid and frightened. I mean, this is a time for moral courage. We have elections in less than 2 years. I think a lot of Americans, as they see the consequences of this movement, are going to kind of wake up. And we do have an opportunity as people are hurt, as their grievances are not addressed, as their lives aren't getting better. We have an opportunity to say to them, these are the people who are doing this to you, and here are the people who are fighting for you.
Wow, thank you so very much for that. I'm so glad I only have one last question because my other question was about reactionary nihilism. So we actually have a friend, Russell Jones, who we're interviewing next, who's a Byline Times columnist. And he has a great line where he basically says one of the greatest ways to cure extreme capitalism is to go through extreme capitalism. It's like, people aren't going to like it. He tells a story about the Tufton Street extremists finally getting their girl in power, Liz Truss, finally getting her, and she's going to go do everything that they want. And she lasts 49 days. So there are people I know in the UK who already have Trump in a head of lettuce, and that might be a little hopium, but it certainly made me feel better. My last question for you is about some of the suggestions you have at the end of your book, and you briefed us a little bit on that, but people feel despair and unsure what to do, and you have a whole bunch of ideas, starting with local community work, but anything you can tell people so they can stay in action and out of despair.
Yeah, of course. Look, there is no feature of the American political system as of yet that means the MAGA coalition is going to govern forever. When they lost in 2020, they didn't get into bed and suck their thumbs, right? They got out there and they determined to fight. Now, they did things we would never want to do. They spread lies and disinformation, and they orchestrated or inspired political violence. We would not want to do those kinds of things, but there's so much that we can do. So this is really the time for moral courage. The first thing we need, there's no substitute for the power of the vote. I mean, one of the ways that this movement is as powerful as it is it because it really focuses on its base of voters, and it goes after low propensity voters. And they don't just go after voters like 2 months before a national election. They're campaigning throughout the year with really sophisticated messaging, data operations, and voter turnout operations. We have to remember that this is a minority of the country, not a majority, but it's a disproportionately motivated minority. In advance of 2024, they identified, I think it was 19 swing districts in 7 swing states. And they figured if we can get these districts in these swing states, we can win the election because, it's just strategic that way. And they operated in large measure through conservative churches. They know if they can get their people out at, rate of 95% or whatever, you can turn out 95% of a church congregation, you can really impact an election in that district. So, I remember a few years ago, I heard Ralph Reed, who's one of the movement's most strategic and I would say astute strategists. He said, pay no attention to the polls. Our numbers are shrinking. All that matters is who turns out on election day. And he's right. So there's a lot of ways to get involved in voter turnout operations, but there are things we can do as individuals, like volunteer to babysit for that young mom who's got little kids so that she can actually have time to get to the polls, or find someone who doesn't drive or who has maybe a disability or is a little bit older, volunteer to drive them, hold people in your circles. if you're part of a club or a sporting team, or you're part of a faith community, try and communicate the importance of voting, not just in national elections, but in local elections, in the midterms, and make sure people understand they need to vote all the way down the ballot. Second, we need to abandon, this is a big thing, purity tests. We're a really big tent.
Yeah.
Of us is sort of moderate conservative, moderate liberal, progressive left. It's like a really big, noisy, complicated group. We're often sort of like the narcissism of small differences. We exclude people because they don't agree with us on this one little policy or another. But here's the thing, we're not going to agree on everything, and we're not going to get everything we want. And frankly, we probably shouldn't. It's like a big family with 8 kids. Is every kid going to get what they want? No. But if we can agree more on than we disagree on, if we can agree on some basic democratic principles, then we can work together, and we should.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you so much for this beautiful interview. I'm taking away moral courage. I think it's also worth noting that you found your way to this work in your own community. There's no community that is not being touched and not being targeted. And it is a minority movement. And the pro democracy faction in America is much, much greater. And as you said, when people are ready to turn away from MAGA, we better be ready to embrace them. Oh my gosh, thank you so much. Money lies in God. Gentlemen, anything else?
Thank you so much for being here. It was
Thank
amazing.
you.
Thank you.
It's really
Thank
great to
you.
be with you guys. Thank you so much. I really appreciate what you're doing.
Thank